I was just finishing up trade at the outpost, a spit of a place called Three Palms, when I saw it. The desert plays tricks on your eyes when the sun's high and your canteen's low, and I figured this was one of 'em. Looked like a shimmer. At first a ghost shape staggering across the sand, but then it dropped, hard. Right there, maybe 20 paces from my horse. At first I didn't move. Thought it might be a trap. Bandits had clever ways of baiting fools in the territory. But something about the way that figure crumpled slow, like bones had finally given up, cut through my suspicion. I rode over. What I found weren't a mirage at all. It was a woman, Apache, barely alive. Her dress was torn near to rags, face sunburnt and caked with blood and grit, one eye swollen shut. Her feet were raw, cracked open in places. She looked like she'd walked across the whole damn desert just to die in front of me. I dismounted, knelt beside her, and felt her pulse with shaking fingers. It was there barely. I whispered something, I don't know what, maybe a prayer, and lifted her in my arms. She didn't weigh more than a sack of feed. My horse shifted as I swung up with her in my lap, but didn't protest. I kicked him into motion, spurring toward the spring I knew about 3 miles north, a little pool fed by underground rock, cool even in this hell heat. The ride was quiet but desperate. Her breath came in tiny hitches against my chest, and more than once I looked down thinking she'd gone still. But each time I felt the faintest rise in her chest, still fighting, just barely. I didn't ask myself why I was doing it. There. Wasn't time for that. When I reached the spring, I slid down quick, cradled her limp body in my arms, and dipped a rag into the water. I squeezed it over her lips, watching the drops soak into the cracks. She stirred. Not much, but enough. Soaked my coat and draped it over her. The sun was still mean, and she didn't have much skin left that wasn't burned raw. The spring gurgled gentle behind us, while the rest of the world stayed quiet, too quiet. Buzzards circled overhead. I was used to being alone in this country, but this felt different, like something had shifted. I didn't know who she was, didn't know where she'd come from or what devils had chased her across the sand. But I knew one thing, I wasn't going to let her die here. Not alone, not like that. She didn't open her eyes when I laid her down beside the spring, but her lips moved a dry whisper, too faint to make out. I took it as a good sign. She was still. In there, I cupped my hand in the water, lifted it to her mouth. She turned her head, didn't try to speak, just flinched like I'd offered poison. I sat back on my heels, gave her space. All right, I said softly. Ain't gonna force it. You decide. I waited. Wind stirred the mesquite. A crow cawed somewhere far off. The sun kept burning like the world didn't care. I poured water into a tin cup, placed it by her side, and moved away. Minutes passed. Then her hand crept toward the cup. She knocked it over by accident. Her fingers too weak. I didn't move. Let her see I wasn't coming unless she wanted me to. She tried again. This time she got it. The sound of her drinking, those slow gulps, her throat working like she hadn't tasted water in days, settled something inside me. I didn't realize. Was wound so tight. When the cup emptied, she looked at me. Just for a moment, there was no thanks in her eyes. Only weariness, suspicion, but also something else. A flicker of surrender, like a wild thing too tired to run anymore. I stood slowly, walked to my horse, and pulled out jerky and half a biscuit from my saddlebag. I left them on a flat rock near the water and backed away again. She ate, carefully, slowly, but she ate. When dusk came, I gathered wood and made a small fire. She didn't speak, I didn't push. Some wounds take more than a hot meal and kind words to heal. I laid out a blanket for her, then set my own down across the fire. She kept her eyes on me the whole time, like she expected me to turn into something worse at any second. Before sleep, I said, cabin's half a day from here. Good roof, food, medicine, you're welcome if you want it. She didn't respond. I didn't expect her to, but the next morning, when I mounted up and offered my hand, she took it, didn't say a word, just climbed up behind me, slow and stiff. Her arms didn't wrap around me. They hovered, awkward and unsure. But she stayed on. That was enough. We rode in silence, the desert rising around us in long hills and flat, red stone. I felt her forehead press against my back, once brief and accidental, like her body forgot to be cautious for a second. When my cabin came into view, I felt her shift behind me. I didn't look back, just said, "Ain't much, but it's safe." Still, no answer, but she stayed in the saddle. When I stopped, she slid down on her own. Wobbly but proud, stubborn, she looked at the cabin, then at me. Then, quietly, walked inside. And just like that, I had company. My cabin wasn't much. One room, low beams, stone hearth, and a cot I'd built myself. No doors inside, just wool blankets hung for warmth and privacy. The woman walked, and like she was testing the floorboards with each step, wary of traps in the wood. I offered her the cot. She looked at it, then at me, and shook her head. Sat cross-legged on the floor instead, back to the wall, eyes never leaving mine. So I gave her space. I heated broth over the fire, dropped in what dried vegetables I had left, and tore strips of salted meat into it. When it was ready, I poured a bowl and set it down close to her, but not too close. She didn't touch it at first. I sat by the fire, sipping mine. After a long while, I heard the soft clink of the spoon. She was eating. Next day, I worked outside splitting logs. Kept the door open so she could see me, see I wasn't hiding anything. Every once in a while, I'd glance up and catch her shadow in the doorway, watching. That night, I left a comb on the washstand. Old thing. My mother's. Figured she might want it. She didn't use it right away, but by morning, her braids were neat, her face washed. My coat, which she'd worn for warmth, was folded by the fire. She still hadn't said a word. For 3 nights we barely exchanged a look. But her silence wasn't cold, it was cautious, measured, like a woman who'd had too many reasons not to trust anyone. I didn't push, just kept cooking, mending things, letting the quiet stretch between us like a rope not pulled tight yet. On the 4th night I came in from tending the mule to find her standing by the fire, not sitting, not hiding. She looked different, less hollow, more present. She held out her hands. One had a piece of cloth I didn't recognize, a faded sash embroidered with red thread. The other held a wooden carving, an old desert animal, maybe a jackrabbit or a fox. I hadn't seen her carving, but it was smooth, careful. A gift, maybe, or a gesture. I didn't take either. Not yet. Instead, I nodded and said, "You don't owe me nothing. Not for the water, not for the food. You stay as long as you need." That's when her eyes softened. Just a flicker. But it was there. She didn't hand me the items, just set them gently on the hearth and sat down on the cot. Her back no longer to the wall, her body no longer braced for flight. I didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but I knew this. Whatever had happened to her out there in the desert, it hadn't taken everything. Somewhere under that quiet was a fire that hadn't gone out. I was starting to feel the heat. It was the 3rd evening since she'd stepped foot inside my cabin. I just lit the lantern when I heard the soft shuffle of her steps behind me. I turned slow, careful not to startle her. She wasn't near the fire. This time, she was beside me. Her eyes didn't dart around the room like before. They stayed on mine, steady, open, like she'd made a choice. She sat down next to me, close enough for our shoulders to brush, and let out the smallest sigh, like something had loosened inside her chest. Then she did something that near knocked the breath out of me. She reached over and laid her hand on mine. It wasn't a light touch or a nervous one. It was firm, certain. Her skin was warm from the fire and rough from wind and hardship, but there was peace in it, a quiet strength that said more than any words could have. I didn't move. Couldn't. Her voice came soft, low with an accent. Thick as smoke. You gave life, I want to give back. I didn't understand at first. Thought maybe she meant the food, the fire, the roof over her head. I opened my mouth to tell her she didn't owe me a damn thing, but she wasn't done. I want to give you something greater. There was a long silence after that. Her hand stayed on mine. My heart was knocking like a horse against a stall wall. I didn't dare breathe. Something in her eyes shifted, like this wasn't just gratitude. Like she was offering me something far deeper. Something decided long before I ever rode into that stretch of sand. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Just nodded slow, swallowed hard. She didn't press, didn't explain. Just let the weight of those words hang in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Then, gentle as a breeze, she got up and walked to the cot, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, lay down without another glance. I stared at the wall for hours that night. Her words rattled around in my head like loose nails in a bucket. Something greater. What could that mean? Was she offering herself? A wife? A life? Something more sacred than coin or cattle? I'd lived most of my years alone, content with silence and saddle sores. But this woman, this stranger, I found myself wondering what her world looked like. What it felt like to belong to someone beyond obligation or survival. I didn't sleep much. But when I finally shut my eyes, I dreamed of red cloth and carved animals, of cool water poured over burning skin, and of her hand resting over mine, calm as dusk. I didn't know what was coming next, but I knew this much, it was already changing. The days that followed moved slow, like honey left too long in the cold. She didn't speak much, but she didn't have to. Her eyes said plenty. She rose early, swept the floor without being asked, folded blankets I'd left rumpled, even, brought back herbs and roots I'd long forgotten how to find. I'd wait to see her crouch near the fire, grinding something in a bowl, the cabin filled with the earthy scent of sage and pine. She wasn't just recovering, she was preparing. For what? I didn't yet know. She watched me different now, not like a stray dog watching the hand that might strike, but like a woman studying a man she'd already decided something about. Her gaze didn't flinch anymore. It lingered, curious, measured, that should have comforted me. But if I'm honest, it rattled me. One morning, I found a bundle beside my saddle, tied in hide, small and careful. Inside was a bone-handled knife, old but sharp, polished clean. The initials carved into the hilt worked mine. She saw me holding it, and said nothing. Another day, I returned from checking the fence to find strips of deer meat hanging to dry on the porch. I hadn't killed. No deer. She had used one of my old bows I hadn't touched in years. Didn't say a word about it. Just nodded once as I looked at the meat, then went back to tending the fire. Whatever her plan was, it was unfolding quietly around me, like watching seeds sprout after a rain. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of waiting for something. Like she was building toward a moment I couldn't see yet. That night, she set 2 bowls on the table and sat across from me for the first time. No fire between us. Just wood grain and food and silence. She didn't touch her bowl. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her dress and placed something on the table. A necklace, simple leather cord, strung with 3 carved beads, bone, turquoise, and cedar. She slid it toward me. Didn't speak. Just looked. I didn't reach for it. Something in the gesture felt ceremonial. Like this was part of a custom older than anything I'd ever known. A man like me, white, alone, plain in thought and action, wasn't meant to understand it. But I could feel it. The meaning behind it. The gravity. I looked at her. She didn't smile. Didn't look away. And that's when I understood. This wasn't a gift. It was a sign. A signal. She was preparing me. Not for a simple thank you, or a one-time gesture, but for a joining. A union. Not with her, but with something or someone she hadn't yet brought into the room. I laid the necklace back down, careful not to disrespect it. Then I nodded once, and she rose, walked to the door, and stared out toward the desert, toward whatever was coming. She was gone when I woke. No note. No prints. Just the necklace still lying on the table, and the fire burned low in the hearth. I waited, tended chores, patched a fence rail just to keep my hands busy, but my mind wouldn't sit still. Every few minutes I'd glance down the trail leading east, where the land sloped into hard stone and red dust, where the silence stretched long by sunset. I'd half convinced myself she wasn't coming back. Then I saw movement on the ridge. 2 figures. One I knew instantly, the slow, steady gait, the shawl wrapped over her shoulders. The other was taller, straighter, young by the way she carried herself. Maybe late teens, maybe 20. Long black hair tied tight at her back, and eyes like polished onyx that didn't blink when they met mine. They stopped a dozen paces from the cabin. The woman didn't speak, just nodded at me once, then turned and placed her hand on the young one's shoulder. "My daughter," she said. First time I'd heard her voice since that night by the fire. "Her name is Naili." Naili, the girl, said nothing, didn't smile, just stood there, eyes sharp as flint. I stepped forward, heart in my throat, unsure if I should speak or bow or offer my hand. But before I could do any of it, the mother reached into her bag and pulled out the necklace, the one I'd left on. The table. She held it out toward me. I understood. This wasn't a thank you, wasn't a favor. It was a proposal, not from her, but from the bloodline that had survived and now stood before me. Naili looked me up and down like a general inspecting a soldier. Her eyes didn't soften, but something in her jaw relaxed, just a little, like she approved of what she saw, or at least didn't reject it. I took the necklace, not quickly, not with pride, but with both hands, slow and respectful, like I was lifting something sacred. She stepped forward, not shy, not hesitant. She walked past me into the cabin like it already belonged to her. The mother followed. That night we ate in silence, the fire casting long shadows across the walls. Naili sat where the woman once had, upright, steady, observing everything, every spoonful I took, every glance I made. She wasn't cruel, just measured. A daughter raised to be traded for peace, or a woman choosing her own path. I didn't. No, but there was power in her, a presence that filled the room. Later the mother spoke again, voice low but sure. "She is my gift, my trust, my return." I didn't answer right away. The words caught somewhere between fear and reverence. But eventually I nodded. "I'll treat her with respect," I said. "Whatever she decides, she decides." Naili looked at me for a long time. Then, for the first time, she smiled. Barely a curve, but enough. And somehow I knew this was the start of something neither of us could undo. The days that followed moved with quiet rhythm, like a song with no words, just a steady beat of footsteps on packed earth and firewood cracking in the stove. Eli didn't speak much at first, but she watched everything. Watched me hitch the mule, salt the meat, stir the beans. Watched how I folded the blankets, how I cleaned my rifle. It wasn't judgment, not exactly, more like study. We shared the cabin now, though it hadn't been spoken aloud. The mother stayed for 2 more nights, then left without a word at dawn. I stood outside as she disappeared into the desert, the shawl whipping behind her like smoke from a dying fire. Naili didn't watch her go. She was already inside, sweeping the floor. That night she sat at the table and pointed at the beans I was stirring. Too much salt. It was the first time she'd corrected me. I grinned. "You might be right." She gave a single nod. A hint of amusement danced in her eyes. Over the next week, the air between us shifted. The cabin, once built for silence, now held small sounds, her hum while grinding herbs, the rustle of her hair as she brushed it by the fire, the creak of the floor as we passed each other without awkwardness. We didn't speak much, but what we said mattered. One afternoon, she came out with a bundle of my shirts, washed, mended, laid out on the fence rail to dry. I tried to thank her. She shook her head. Not debt, she said. Life. I didn't press. That evening I taught her to shoot my old Colt. Her aim was decent, but her focus was better. She hit the pine stop 3 times out of 5, then handed it back without pride. I cooked us rabbit stew. She salted it better than I ever had. Then came the night she laughed. It was nothing at first. I'd spilled water on my pants, muttered something about my own clumsiness, and she chuckled, a low, surprised sound, like it had caught her off guard. But once it started, it stayed. She laughed like someone who'd forgotten how, but remembered. Just in time, I found myself staring at her, not the way a man stares at a woman, but the way someone watches spring bloom after a cruel winter. Slow, quiet, grateful. Later, we sat on the porch. The stars stretched overhead like a roof stitched by hand. She leaned against a post, arms crossed, face lit by the moon. I thought you'd smell like sweat and mule, she said. I blinked. And you smell like cedar and coffee. We both laughed, and in that moment something clicked, like 2 wheels finally locking into the same groove. Not love. Not yet, but belonging. The kind that didn't need explaining, but the kind that didn't ask for permission. Asterisk. That final evening came wrapped in wind. The kind that carries sand through cracks and whispers through brush like it's got something holy to say. We just finished supper corn cakes and beans when the door creaked open on its own, pushed by the breeze. I got up to close it, but Naeli stepped in front of me. Her mother was there. She hadn't made a sound, hadn't knocked, just stood in the doorway with her shawl pulled tight and eyes shining like polished flint. In her weathered hands she held nothing. Instead, she stepped inside, walked between us, and stopped at the hearth. She looked at me, long, quiet. Then she took my hand, not with ceremony, not with weight, just placed it in Neely's, and stepped back. Naeli didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She looked up at me, her dark eyes calm, her shoulders square. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her hand tightened around mine. Choice, not an obligation. A bridge, not a debt. And right then, in that tiny cabin beneath that rattling wind, I felt every wall I'd built over the years lean inward. Not fall, not crash. Just lean. Enough to let the light in. I looked at her mother, at the woman who once crawled through the desert half dead, who now stood tall, strong, steady. She nodded once, then turned and left without a word. Naeli and I stood there, a long time, hand in hand, while the wind swept around the cabin like a blessing. It wasn't a wedding. There was no preacher, no paper, no ring, but something was bound that night all the same, and I knew, deep as bone, that this wasn't chance. This was the desert's doing, the fire's mercy, a rescue that turned into a life, a mirage that became real.